Welcome back. Over the next 4 days last week, a special commission set up to examine the deadliest high school shooting in the country gathered in Broward, releasing new and disturbing details in the shooting deaths. And while much of the focus has been on Broward Deputy Scott Peterson, who heard the gunfire but did not go into the building, we now know there were 8 other Broward deputies who arrived, heard gunfire, and also chose to remain outside. And while the public has been outraged by the deputies' conduct, we learned last week that deputies weren't required to go in because it is the official policy of the Sheriff's Department that deputies may, and that's the key word, may go in, not shall go into the building during a shooting. Even more troubling, we now know who put the word may into that policy.
The reason I inserted may and believe wholeheartedly in that word, Sheriff, is because I want an effective tactical response, not a suicide response. The goal of any agency's response is to save lives. May allows a deputy discretion.
But the problem for the sheriff is he can't bluster his way through the commission. There are 5 sheriffs and 1 police chief from other parts of the state who sit on the commission, and they rejected Israel's position. Here is Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd.
But words matter. And according to your policy, he didn't have to go in. His training might have dictated that. Certainly, I'm sure, dictated that. I couldn't agree more with you that you certainly don't want to send a law enforcement officer into a suicide situation. But your policy clearly gives him the option. Our policy says you shall go in and eliminate the threat. And that is, there is no margin for error with that. We don't see.
And so it went. Israel was confronted with the fact that his deputies complained they weren't given adequate active shooter training, with some saying they couldn't remember the last time they received it. The commission was also told that the sheriff's staff failed the test of leadership. Here's Okaloosa County Sheriff Larry Ashley.
The response was inadequate for a whole number of reasons. Nobody seemed to take control of the scene.
And when Sheriff Israel tried to make excuses, the chair of the commission, Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri, grew incensed.
Sergeant Miller, he sat up on Holmberg Road for over 10 minutes. He heard gunshots and he didn't move. He never got on the radio. He was the first supervisor on the scene, and he never moved. Even after deputies and officers were going into that building, that man never moved until he moseyed down to the sawgrass to the command post. And that man was the first sergeant on the scene. There was no radio throttling issues or no communication issues. He didn't act.
Okay, let's bring in my guest. Ryan Petty's daughter was one of the students killed in Parkland, and he is also a member of the commission looking for answers. Ryan, thank you very much for coming in.
Good morning, Jim.
So we'll later in the show talk about the school district, but let's stay on the Sheriff's Department for a second. What was your reaction to how the Sheriff's Department handled it based on what you've learned?
Well, there was clearly a difference in response that day between the Coral Springs Police Department and the Broward Sheriff's Office, and I attribute much of that difference to a couple of things. One is the policy, and you heard Sheriff Judd talk about the words and the language, and I called Sheriff Israel out on that also. The word may allow Deputy Peterson to stand behind a cement barricade for over 45 minutes while innocent children and teachers were being slaughtered inside the 1200 building.
But he wasn't alone in staying out of the building, not a sense of urgency to go in.
There was clearly, as Sheriff Gualtieri said, there was a lack of urgency on the part of some BSO deputies. Now, I want to be clear. There were many that acted heroically that day, and I am grateful for their actions. But as a department, there was clearly a difference between the Coral Springs response and the BSO response. And I attribute that to the policy, training or lack thereof, and that all points to leadership.
one of the issues that was also discussed was the issue of the radios, the transmissions that were coming in, the fact that the Broward radio systems do not gel well together. Sheriff Israel made repeated excuses as to why this isn't the case. He blamed the Broward Commission. He blamed others. He blamed other cities. He blamed the dead mayor of Coral Springs for not allowing the system to come through. I want to play a piece of sound, and he at one point even whined and complained maybe the commission can do something about it. I want to play some sound from Chair Gualtieri, what his response was about the issue of the radios. Let's play that now.
Sometimes people don't have the will to do it, the desire to do it, and they're going to continue down this path with the reasons they can't. They need to get to yes on this. They need to get to the finish line on this and figure out not what they want, but what they can live with and compromise on it. And if not, the Florida legislature must mandate that every 911 center in the state that takes an EMS call, a fire call, a police call, can immediately communicate with the units that are responsible for responding. And there's no excuse for that not to happen in the state of Florida in 2018.
What struck me about that moment in particular was that was a leader. That was someone who was taking responsibility and saying, we have to make this done. Whereas what I heard from Sheriff Israel was a lot of excuses as to why it hadn't been done.
Jim, when you listen to the audio recordings of the 911 calls and you hear the voices of those students and the parents that called in also, it's heart-wrenching. For me, the audio was more difficult than watching the video of what happened. Sheriff Gualtieri is absolutely right. A leader understands that this is vital to the safety and security of the citizens of Broward County. And as the preeminent law enforcement officer in the county, Sheriff Israel should be leading on this, not pointing the fingers at everyone else and blaming them for in my view, his lack of leadership on this issue.
I know that you're now working towards creating recommendations for both the school district, for the entire state, for the school district and for the sheriff's department. You're starting to put those together now. We'll probably come out with the first draft in January. Is recommending whether or not Sheriff Israel should remain an issue that you'll deal with, or is that something separate? You'll just be making recommendations as to how his department should improve?
I think it will be more the latter than the former. We won't get into the political aspects of it. What we're attempting to do is create a set of guidelines for all of the counties, all of the school districts, all of the law enforcement agencies within the state on lessons learned, first of all, and improvements and things that they can do better. And we'll leave the issue of Sheriff Israel to the political side, but clearly there was a failure of leadership here.
We're going to turn to the school district in a moment, but I should have backed up and asked you this. Sitting on this commission, how difficult has this been for you?
I'm reliving February 14th, which was the worst day of my life. So why are you doing it? First of all, I owe it to my daughter Elena for what she meant in the brief time she was here with us. It's an honor to represent the other families that lost victims, that lost loved ones that day, and I'm doing it because those that were injured in our community deserve answers. We need to know the truth, and we need to warn others that this can happen to them.
All right, let's take a break here, and we'll come back and talk about the school district. Up next, we look at Broward School Superintendent Robert Runcie as he appeared before the commission.